The air crackled with the kind of heat that made your skin hum, the kind that promised something life-altering was about to happen. Elliot stood frozen, his fingers tingling where Miles' hand had grazed his, a fleeting touch that felt like a spark igniting dry grass. He didn't dare look up, afraid his eyes would betray the storm raging inside him. It was a Sunday afternoon in Willow Creek, a sleepy suburb outside Seattle where everyone knew your name and your secrets. The annual community picnic was in full swing. Blankets sprawled across the park, kids shrieking as they chased a soccer ball, and the smoky scent of barbecue weaving through the air. Elliot, 24 and perpetually caught between who he was and who he wanted to be, had come with his best friend, Clara. She was somewhere now, probably flirting with the guy who ran the local coffee shop. But Elliot's world had narrowed to the picnic table where Miles, his cousin's best friend, stood too close, his presence like a magnet pulling Elliot's carefully guarded heart off its axis. Miles was everything Elliot wasn't: bold, unapologetic, with a laugh that could charm the clouds from the sky. At 26, he carried himself like he owned every room he walked into, even if that room was a sprawling park under a July sun. His dark eyes flickered with mischief as he leaned in, pretending to reach for the same lemonade bottle Elliot had just touched. Their fingers brushed, and Miles didn't pull away. Not immediately. The contact lingered, deliberate, a silent question hanging between them. "You gonna drink that or just stare at it?" Miles' voice was low, teasing, but there was an edge to it, like he was testing the waters. Elliot's throat tightened. He forced a laugh, hoping it didn't sound as shaky as he felt. "Didn't know you were so thirsty." Miles smirked, his gaze holding Elliot's for a beat too long before he stepped back, popping the cap off the bottle with a casual flick of his thumb. "Guess I am." Elliot's cousin, Sarah, appeared then, oblivious to the undercurrent between them. She was Miles' childhood friend, the reason he was even here, crashing a picnic he had no real ties to. "Miles, stop hogging the drinks," she called, tossing her blonde hair as she dragged him toward a group playing frisbee. But as he walked away, Miles glanced back at Elliot, and that look, it was a promise, a dare, a secret shared in broad daylight. Elliot tried to focus on the picnic, on the normalcy of it all. He helped Clara carry a tray of watermelon slices, nodded politely as Mrs. Henderson droned on about her gardenias. But his eyes kept finding Miles, laughing with Sarah, tossing a frisbee with effortless grace, his white shirt catching the sunlight. Every time their gazes met, it was like a hook sinking deeper into Elliot's chest. He'd spent years hiding who he was, burying his feelings under layers of "I'm fine," and "it's just easier this way." Growing up in Willow Creek, where church potlucks outnumbered pride flags 100-1, being anything other than straight felt like shouting into a void. But Miles' touch, that brief, electric moment, had cracked something open inside him. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd thinned. Families packed up, kids grew sleepy, and the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park. Elliot found himself wandering toward the edge of the field, where a cluster of oak trees stood like silent sentinels. He needed air, space to breathe, to untangle the knot of want and fear twisting inside him. He didn't hear Miles approach until he was there, his shadow falling across the grass. "You're quiet today," Miles said, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier bravado. He stood close, too close, his hands shoved into his pockets like he was trying to keep them from doing something reckless. Elliot's heart pounded, just thinking. About what? Miles stepped closer, his eyes searching Elliot's face. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Elliot wanted to say something clever, something to deflect, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he looked at Miles, really looked at him, and saw something raw, something unguarded. It was enough to make him brave, just for a second. "About you," Elliot said, barely above a whisper. Miles' breath hitched, and for a moment, the world was just the two of them, standing at the edge of something dangerous and beautiful. Then Miles reached out, his hand grazing Elliot's arm, and the touch was a question, a plea, a beginning. They slipped beneath the trees, where the shadows swallowed them whole. The sounds of the picnic faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of cicadas. Elliot's pulse raced as Miles stopped, turning to face him. There was no teasing now, no playful smirk, just a quiet intensity that made Elliot's knees weak. "I've been watching you all day," Miles said, his voice low and rough. "Trying to figure you out." Elliot swallowed hard. And I think you're scared. But not of me." Miles took a step closer, his hand brushing Elliot's again, this time lingering. "You're scared of what you want." The words hit like a punch, stripping away every defense Elliot had built. He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but Miles was right. He'd spent so long running from himself, from the truth of who he was, that standing here, inches from someone who saw him, really saw him, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. "I don't know how to do this," Elliot admitted, his voice shaking. "Not here. Not in this town." Miles' expression softened, but his eyes burned with something fierce. "Then let me show you." Before Elliot could respond, Miles closed the distance between them, his lips brushing Elliot's in a kiss that was tentative at first, then hungry, desperate, like they'd both been starving for this moment. Elliot's hands found Miles' shirt, clutching the fabric as if it could anchor him to this fleeting, perfect thing. Beneath the trees, the world felt different, bigger, braver, theirs. But as they pulled apart, breathless, the sound of laughter from the picnic snapped them back to reality. Elliot's chest tightened with a familiar fear. What if someone saw? What if Sarah found out? What if this moment, this fragile, beautiful thing, shattered under the weight of Willow Creek's small-town gaze? Miles seemed to sense it. He pressed his forehead to Elliot's, his voice a whisper. "We don't have to figure it all out today, but I'm not going anywhere." Elliot nodded, his throat too tight for words. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not just by Miles, but by himself. And as they stepped back into the sunlight, hand in hand for one fleeting moment before letting go, Elliot knew nothing would ever be the same. The picnic lingered into the evening, the sky bruising purple as fireflies began their quiet dance. Elliot couldn't shake the heat of Miles' kiss, the way it had burned through every wall he'd built around himself. He stood by the dessert table, pretending to care about the brownies, but his eyes kept drifting to Miles, who was helping Sarah fold blankets, his laughter carrying across the park like a melody Elliot couldn't unhear. He wanted to go back to the trees, to that hidden world where he could be brave. But here, in the open, with neighbors milling about and the weight of expectation pressing down, Elliot felt like he was balancing on a tightrope. Every glance from Miles was a tug, pulling him towards something he'd spent years convincing himself he could never have. Sarah bounded over, her energy as relentless as ever. "Elliot, you're coming to the bonfire, right?" she asked, oblivious to the tension coiling inside him. "Miles is staying over tonight, so we're all hanging out at my place after this." Elliot's stomach flipped. Miles in Sarah's house, just across the hall from where Elliot sometimes crashed after late-night movie marathons with his cousin. The thought of being that close to him, with only walls and unspoken truths between them, was dizzying. "Yeah, sure," Elliot said, his voice steadier than he felt. He caught Miles' eye across the table, and the slight curve of Miles' lips sent a shiver down his spine. The bonfire was a Willow Creek tradition, a smaller affair for the younger crowd after the families went home. By the time they arrived at Sarah's backyard, the fire was roaring, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the dozen or so friends sprawled on lawn chairs and blankets. Elliot sat on the edge of the group, nursing a soda, his nerves buzzing like the cicadas in the trees. Miles plopped down beside him, close enough that their knees brushed. "You're quiet again," he said, his tone light but his eyes searching. "Just taking it all in," Elliot replied, gesturing vaguely at the fire. He could feel the warmth of Miles' leg against his, a silent anchor in the chaos of his thoughts. Sarah, ever the host, was passing out marshmallows and skewers, her laughter cutting through the chatter. "Miles, tell them about that time you tried to surf in Oregon," she called, oblivious to the way Miles' attention was fixed on Elliot. Miles grinned, launching into a story about wiping out spectacularly on a freezing beach. The group laughed, but Elliot barely heard the words. He was too focused on the way Miles' hand rested on the grass, inches from his own, a quiet invitation. He wanted to reach out, to bridge that gap, but the fear of being seen, of being judged, clamped down on him like a vice. As the night wore on, the group dwindled, some heading home, others pairing off to talk in hushed tones. Sarah was distracted, flirting with a guy named Jake by the fire pit. Miles leaned closer to Elliot, his voice low. "Want to take a walk?" Elliot's heart stuttered. He nodded, and they slipped away from the glow of the fire, wandering toward the wooded edge of Sarah's property. The air was cooler here, the darkness wrapping around them like a shield. Under the cover of the trees, Miles stopped, turning to face Elliot. "You okay?" Miles asked, his voice soft but laced with concern. "You've been jumpy all night." Elliot let out a shaky laugh. "I'm not used to this." He gestured between them, the words feeling too big, too raw. "I've never." "Never what?" Miles stepped closer, his eyes locked on Elliot's. "Never let yourself want something? Or never let someone want you?" The question hit like a tidal wave. Elliot's breath caught, and he looked away, the weight of years spent hiding pressing down on him. "Both," he admitted finally. "I've spent so long trying to be normal. Whatever that means." Miles reached out, his fingers brushing Elliot's jaw, tilting his face up. "You don't have to be anything you're not. Not with me." The words were a lifeline, and Elliot clung to them. He leaned into Miles' touch, letting himself feel the warmth, the possibility. Their lips met again, softer this time, but no less urgent. It was a kiss that spoke of promises, of futures neither of them could fully see but both wanted to chase. But the moment was shattered by the crunch of footsteps. "Elliot?" "Miles." Sarah's voice cut through the darkness, sharp with confusion. They pulled apart, Elliot's heart hammering as his cousin stepped into view, her brow furrowed. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting between them. The firelight caught her face, and Elliot saw something flicker there, surprise, maybe, or suspicion. Miles, ever quick on his feet, flashed a grin. "Just getting some air. Fire's a bit much tonight." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she shrugged. "Come back soon, okay? Jake's telling ghost stories, and they're terrible." As she turned back toward the fire, Elliot's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of her unspoken questions, the risk of discovery looming like a storm cloud. Miles squeezed his hand, a silent reassurance, but it wasn't enough to quiet the fear clawing at Elliot's chest. They returned to the bonfire, sitting a little farther apart now, the space between them heavy with what they couldn't say. Elliot watched the flames, his mind racing. He wanted Miles, wanted this, whatever it was, but the cost of it, in a town like Willow Creek, felt impossibly high. As the night ended and they headed inside, Miles lingered by the door, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll figure this out, Elliot. Together." Elliot nodded, but the knot in his chest didn't loosen. He lay awake that night in Sarah's guest room, the memory of Miles' touch burning through him, wondering if he was brave enough to face what came next. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the guest room window, but Elliot felt like he was waking into a dream he wasn't ready for. Miles was still asleep on the couch downstairs, his presence in the house a quiet hum beneath Elliot's skin. Every creak of the floorboards, every muffled laugh from Sarah in the kitchen, felt like a reminder that the world hadn't stopped spinning, even if Elliot's had. He pulled on a hoodie and crept downstairs, hoping to slip out before anyone noticed. But Sarah was at the stove, flipping pancakes, and Miles was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee. His hair was mussed, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but when he saw Elliot, his face lit up with a smile that made Elliot's heart lurch. "Morning, sleepyhead," Miles said, his tone casual but his gaze anything but. Sarah turned, grinning. "You two are up early. Hungry?" Elliot mumbled something about needing air and grabbed his shoes, his pulse racing. He needed space to think, to process the weight of last night. The kiss, Sarah's interruption, the fear that had kept him awake. He stepped onto the porch, the cool morning air a shock against his flushed skin. Miles followed, closing the door softly behind him. "You're running again," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. Elliot leaned against the railing, staring out at the quiet street. I'm not running. I don't know how to do this, Miles. Not here. Miles stepped closer, his voice low. You keep saying here like it's a prison. It's just a place, Elliot. It doesn't own you. But it feels like it does. Elliot shot back, his voice sharper than he meant. You don't get it. You breeze into town, all charm and confidence. But I live here. I see these people every day. If they knew, he stopped, his throat tight. My parents, Sarah, everyone, they'd look at me differently. Miles' expression softened, but there was a fire in his eyes. Maybe some will, but not everyone, and not the people who matter. Elliot wanted to believe him, but the fear was a living thing, coiled tight in his chest. He'd grown up hearing the whispers at church, the casual slurs tossed around at school. Being himself felt like inviting a storm he wasn't sure he could weather. Miles reached for his hand, but Elliot pulled back, glancing at the house. Not here, he whispered, hating how small his voice sounded. Miles nodded, but his jaw tightened. Okay, but you can't keep pulling away forever. They went back inside, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Sarah was oblivious, chattering about her plans to visit the city with Jake. But Elliot could feel her watching them, her curiosity sharper now, like she was piecing something together. The day passed in a blur of errands and forced normalcy. Elliot helped Sarah at the local bookstore where she worked, shelving novels while Miles tagged along, his presence both a comfort and a challenge. Every brush of their shoulders, every shared glance, was a reminder of what Elliot wanted and what he was afraid to claim. That evening, Sarah dragged them to a local diner, a retro place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't been updated since the 90s. They squeezed into a booth, Sarah and Jake on one side, Elliot and Miles on the other. The closeness was torture, Miles' thigh pressed against Elliot's under the table, a secret they couldn't acknowledge. So, Miles, Sarah said, sipping her milkshake, you sticking around Willow Creek for a while? Miles shrugged, his arm brushing Elliot's as he reached for a fry. Depends. Got some things keeping me here. His eyes flicked to Elliot, a fleeting look that made Elliot's pulse race. Sarah raised an eyebrow, but Jake distracted her with a joke, and the moment passed. Elliot stared at his burger, his appetite gone. He felt like he was living in two worlds. One where he could be with Miles, free and unafraid, and another where every move was scrutinized, every touch a risk. As they left the diner, Miles pulled Elliot aside, his voice low. Meet me tonight. The park, by the trees. Midnight. Elliot hesitated, the weight of the day pressing down on him. But the look in Miles' eyes, steady, unwavering, made something inside him shift. Okay, he said, the word feeling like a leap. That night, as the house fell silent, Elliot slipped out, his heart pounding. The park was dark, the trees looming like guardians. Miles was waiting, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. Without a word, he pulled Elliot into his arms, and they kissed, fierce and desperate, like they could outrun the world if they just held on tight enough. But as they pulled apart, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Who's there? A voice called gruff, unfamiliar. Elliot froze, his blood turning to ice. It was Mr. Callahan, the park's night watchman, a man known for his gossip as much as his flashlight. Miles grabbed Elliot's hand, pulling him deeper into the trees. Run, he whispered, and they did, hearts pounding, branches snapping underfoot. They didn't stop until they were hidden, breathless, the flashlight beam a distant threat. We're okay, Miles said, his voice steady despite their escape. But Elliot wasn't so sure. The fear of being caught, of being exposed, clung to him like damp clothes. I can't keep doing this, Elliot said, his voice breaking. Sneaking around, hiding, it's not who I want to be. Miles cupped his face, his touch gentle but firm. Then don't hide. Be you, Elliot. With me. The words were a challenge, a promise, and Elliot wanted to believe them. But as they slipped back to Sarah's house, the weight of Willow Creek's judgment loomed larger than ever. The days that followed were a tightrope walk between hope and dread. Elliot went through the motions. Work at the hardware store, dinners with his parents, game nights with Sarah, But Miles was a constant undercurrent, pulling at him like a tide. Every text, every stolen glance, was a reminder of the night in the park, the thrill of their escape, and the fear of what it meant to be seen. Miles was staying with Sarah for the week, which meant he was everywhere. He'd show up at the bookstore with coffee, his smile disarming the regulars, or he'd join Elliot and Sarah for movie nights, sitting just close enough to make Elliot's skin hum. But the secrecy was suffocating. Every time Sarah looked at them too long, Elliot's heart raced, convinced she knew. One afternoon, they were at the community center, helping set up for a charity bake sale. The room buzzed with volunteers, the air thick with the scent of sugar and cinnamon. Miles was hauling tables, his sleeves rolled up, his forearms flexing in a way that made it hard for Elliot to focus. Sarah was across the room, arranging cupcakes, when Miles leaned close, his voice a whisper. "Meet me in the back room. 5 minutes." Elliot's stomach flipped, but he nodded, his hands trembling as he stacked chairs. The back room was a cluttered storage space, filled with folding tables and old decorations. When Elliot slipped inside, Miles was there, his eyes bright with that familiar mischief. "We've got to stop meeting like this," Miles said, but his grin said he didn't mean it. He pulled Elliot close, their lips meeting in a kiss that was all heat and urgency, like they were stealing time from the world. But the door creaked open, and they sprang apart. It was Clara, Elliot's best friend, her eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, sorry," she stammered, clutching a box of napkins. "I didn't know." Elliot's face burned, his heart hammering. "It's not, Clara, wait." She was already gone, the door swinging shut behind her. Miles cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "She won't say anything, right?" Elliot shook his head, but he wasn't sure. Clara was his closest friend, the one person he'd trusted with pieces of his truth over the years. But this was different. This was real, undeniable, and the thought of her knowing, of anyone knowing, made his chest tighten. That night, Elliot found Clara at her apartment, her expression unreadable as she let him in. "So," she said, crossing her arms. "You and Miles." Elliot sank onto her couch, his hands twisting together. "It's new. I don't know what it is yet." Clara's face softened. "You don't have to explain, Elle. I just wish you'd told me. I'm your friend, not your judge." Relief flooded him, but it was tinged with fear. "You can't tell anyone, Clara. Not yet. I'm not ready." She nodded, but her eyes were serious. "I won't. But you can't keep this bottled up forever. It's eating you alive." She was right, and it scared him. The weight of hiding was heavy, but the thought of coming out, to Sarah, to his parents, to the whole damn town, felt like stepping into a fire. He left Clara's apartment with her promise of silence, but the knot in his chest only tightened. The next day, Miles suggested they get out of Willow Creek for a bit. "There's a lake an hour away," he said, his eyes bright with the promise of escape. "Just us. No hiding." Elliot hesitated, but the thought of a day without eyes on them was too tempting. They drove out in Miles' beat-up Jeep, the windows down, the radio blasting indie rock. The lake was nestled in a quiet valley, its surface shimmering under the midday sun. They swam, laughed, and for a few hours, Elliot felt free to touch Miles' hand, to kiss him without looking over his shoulder, to be himself. But as they lay on a blanket by the water, Miles' head resting on Elliot's chest, reality crept back in. "What happens when you leave?" Elliot asked, his voice quiet. "You're only here for a week, right?" Miles propped himself up, his expression serious. "I could stay longer. For you." Elliot's heart ached at the words, but doubt gnawed at him. "You don't know what it's like here, Miles. Not long term. This town, it's not kind to people like us." Miles took his hand, his grip firm. "Then we'll make it kind. Or we'll leave. Together." The idea was intoxicating, but it also terrified him. Leaving Willow Creek meant leaving his family, his history, everything he'd ever known. But staying meant hiding, and he wasn't sure he could do that anymore, not with Miles looking at him like he was worth everything. As they drove back, the sun setting behind them, Elliot's phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "We need to talk. Come over tonight." His stomach dropped. Had Clara said something? Had Sarah seen more than he realized? The freedom of the day vanished, replaced by the familiar weight of fear. Miles reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Whatever it is," he said, "we'll face it together." Elliot nodded, but as they pulled into Willow Creek, the town's quiet streets felt like a trap closing around him. Elliot's hands shook as he parked outside Sarah's house that evening. The porch light cast a warm glow, but it did nothing to ease the chill in his chest. Miles sat beside him, his presence steady but not enough to quiet the storm of what-ifs swirling in Elliot's mind. Sarah's text had been vague, but her tone felt like a warning. Inside, Sarah was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. The TV was on, muted, casting flickering shadows across her face. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chairs across from her. Elliot sank into a seat, his heart pounding. Miles sat beside him, close enough that their knees brushed, a silent reminder of his promise. Sarah set her glass down, her eyes moving between them. "I'm not stupid," she said finally. "I've seen the way you two look at each other. The sneaking off, the whispers. What's going on, Elliot?" The room felt too small, the air too thick. Elliot opened his mouth, but no words came. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, being found out, having to explain, but now that it was here, he felt like a deer in headlights. Miles spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "Sarah, it's not about hiding from you. It's new, and we're figuring it out." Her eyes narrowed, but there was no anger there, just confusion. "Figuring what out? Are you two together?" Elliot's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but Miles' hand found his under the table, squeezing gently. It was enough to anchor him, to make him brave. "Yeah," Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are." Sarah blinked, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words. "Okay," she said finally. I didn't know, Elliot. Why didn't you tell me?" The question wasn't accusing, but it cut deep. Elliot looked down, his fingers twisting in his lap. "I was scared. Of what you'd think. Of what everyone would think." Sarah's expression softened. "You're my cousin, Elle. I love you. I'm not going to judge you for who you love." Relief flooded him, but it was bittersweet. Sarah's acceptance was a weight lifted, but she was only one person. The rest of Willow Creek, his parents, his co-workers, the church ladies who smiled at him every Sunday, loomed like a tidal wave. Miles squeezed his hand again, his voice low. "One step at a time." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes serious. "You know Mom and Dad are going to be weird about it, right? They're traditional." Elliot nodded, his stomach twisting. He'd always known his parents would be the hardest hurdle. They weren't cruel, but they were set in their ways, their world built on the quiet comfort of routine and expectation. The thought of shattering that made him feel sick. "I'll deal with them," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Sarah reached out, touching his arm. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, okay?" The rest of the night was quieter, the tension easing but not gone. Sarah didn't push, and Miles stayed close, his presence a steadying force. But as Elliot lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what was coming pressed down on him. Telling Sarah was one thing. Telling the world was another. The next day, Miles suggested they go to the city, a place where they could be themselves without fear. Seattle was only an hour away, but it felt like another world, vibrant, diverse, a place where no one blinked at two guys holding hands. They wandered Pike Place Market, ate fish and chips by the waterfront, and for a few hours, Elliot felt like he could breathe. Miles stopped at a street vendor, buying a small rainbow pin and tucking it into Elliot's jacket pocket. "For when you're ready," he said, his smile soft but full of hope. Elliot's chest ached. He wanted to be ready, wanted to wear that pin and walk through Willow Creek without flinching. But the thought of his parents' faces, of the whispers that would follow, held him back. They returned to Willow Creek that evening, the city's freedom fading with every mile. As they pulled into town, Elliot's phone buzzed, a text from his mom. "Dinner tomorrow night. Bring Sarah. And that friend of hers, Miles." Panic clawed at him. Dinner with his parents was a minefield even without Miles there. With him, it felt like walking into a storm with no shelter. Miles sensed his tension, his hand finding Elliot's. "We've got this," he said, but his voice held a trace of uncertainty. Dinner was at his parents' house, a modest ranch-style home filled with the smell of roast chicken and the weight of unspoken rules. Elliot's mom, Linda, was warm but reserved, her smiles polite but cautious. His dad, Tom, was quieter, his attention fixed on the TV until dinner was served. Miles was charming, as always, deflecting questions with easy humor. But as they sat around the table, Elliot felt the tension building. His mom's eyes lingered on him, like she could sense something was off. When she asked about his plans for the future, her tone was pointed, and Elliot's heart sank. After dinner, as they cleared the table, Linda pulled Elliot aside. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice soft but probing. "Is something going on?" Elliot's mouth went dry. He wanted to tell her, to rip off the bandage, but the words wouldn't come. "Just figuring some stuff out," he said, hating how weak it sounded. She nodded, but her eyes were worried. As Elliot rejoined Miles and Sarah in the living room, he knew the truth was a ticking clock, counting down to a moment he couldn't avoid. The dinner left Elliot rattled, the weight of his mom's unspoken questions lingering like a fog. He and Miles drove back to Sarah's in silence, the night pressing in around them. Miles reached for his hand, but Elliot pulled away, his nerves frayed. "I can't keep doing this," Elliot said, his voice sharp with frustration. "Pretending everything's fine when it's not." Miles parked the car, turning to face him. "Then don't pretend. Tell them, Elliot. Your parents, the town, whoever. You're stronger than you think." Elliot laughed, bitter. "You make it sound so easy. You don't have to live with the fallout." Miles' jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "You're right. I don't. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until you tell me to." The words hit hard, a reminder of what Miles was offering, and what Elliot was too afraid to take. He wanted to believe in a future where they could be together, open and unafraid, but Willow Creek felt like a cage, its bars built from years of whispers and expectations. The next morning, Elliot woke to a text from Clara. "Coffee? Need to talk." His stomach twisted, but he agreed, meeting her at the local cafe. The place was quiet. The morning crowd thinned out, leaving just the hum of the espresso machine and the clink of cups. Clara stirred her latte, her eyes serious. "I heard something at the bake sale yesterday. Mrs. Henderson saw you and Miles in the park the other night. She's talking." Elliot's blood ran cold. Mrs. Henderson was the town's unofficial gossip hub, her words spreading faster than wildfire. "What did she say?" Clara hesitated. "That you two were close. People are starting to notice, Elle." The cafe walls felt like they were closing in. Elliot's hands shook as he gripped his coffee. "What do I do?" Clara reached across the table, her hand covering his. "You don't have to do anything alone, but you need to decide what you want. Hiding's only going to hurt you more." Her words echoed Miles, and they stung. Elliot wanted to be brave, to stand up and claim his truth, but the thought of the town's judgment, of his parents' disappointment, was paralyzing. That afternoon, Miles found him at the hardware store, where Elliot was restocking shelves to keep his hands busy. "Clara called me," Miles said, his voice low. "You okay?" Elliot shook his head, his throat tight. "It's spreading, Miles. People are talking." Miles stepped closer, his eyes fierce. "Let them talk. They don't get to decide who you are." But the words didn't ease the panic clawing at Elliot's chest. He felt like he was drowning, caught between the life he'd always known and the one he wanted with Miles. "I need time," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Miles nodded, but there was pain in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. He sat on Sarah's porch, staring at the stars, the rainbow pin Miles had given him heavy in his pocket. He thought about his parents, about the town, about the boy who'd turned his world upside down. The fear was still there, but so was something else, something stronger, something that felt like hope. The next day, he made a decision. He called his parents, asking them to meet him at the house. Miles offered to come, but Elliot shook his head. "I need to do this alone." His parents were in the living room when he arrived, the same room where they'd had countless family dinners, arguments, and quiet moments. Linda looked worried, Tom stoic as always. Elliot's hands shook as he stood before them, the words he'd rehearsed 100 times tangling in his throat. "Mom, Dad," he started, his voice trembling. "There's something I need to tell you. I'm gay." The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth. Tom's face hardened, his gaze fixed on the floor. Elliot's heart pounded, but he kept going, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. "I've been hiding it for years because I was scared. Scared of what you'd think, what everyone would think. But I can't hide anymore. I'm in love with someone, and he makes me feel whole." Linda's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Elliot braced for rejection. But then she stood, crossing the room to pull him into a hug. "Oh, Elliot," she whispered. "I just want you to be happy." Tom didn't move, his silence heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice gruff. "This is a lot. I need time." It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. Elliot nodded, tears burning his eyes. As he left the house, he felt lighter, like he'd shed a weight he'd carried for years. Miles was waiting outside, leaning against his Jeep. "How'd it go?" he asked, his voice soft. Elliot took a shaky breath. "It's a start." Miles smiled, pulling him into a hug. For the first time, Elliot didn't look over his shoulder, didn't care who saw. He was done hiding. The days after Elliot's confession were a blur of raw emotion and quiet shifts. His mom called daily, her voice tentative but warm, asking questions about Miles, about how Elliot was feeling. His dad remained distant, his "I need time" hanging over Elliot like a storm cloud. But the weight of hiding was gone, replaced by a fragile freedom that grew stronger with every step. Miles stayed in Willow Creek, extending his visit to be there for Elliot. They spent evenings at the park, no longer hiding in the shadows, their hands brushing openly as they walked. The town noticed. Mrs. Henderson's whispers had seen to that, but the stares weren't as heavy as Elliot had feared. Some were curious, some judgmental, but others, like Clara and Sarah, were anchors, their support unwavering. One afternoon, Elliot and Miles volunteered at the community center again, setting up for a local art fair. The room buzzed with activity, but Elliot felt a new ease, a sense of belonging he hadn't known was possible. As they hung paintings, Miles nudged him, pointing to a canvas of two figures under a tree, their hands touching. "Reminds me of us," Miles said, his grin soft but full of meaning. Elliot laughed, the sound freer than it had been in years. "Yeah, it does." Sarah joined them, her eyes bright. "You two are disgustingly cute," she teased, but there was no edge to it, only love. She'd become their biggest cheerleader, deflecting gossip with her fierce loyalty. That evening, the art fair opened, the park glowing with string lights and laughter. Elliot and Miles wandered the booths, sharing cotton candy, their shoulders brushing. For the first time, Elliot didn't flinch at the thought of being seen. He pinned the rainbow pin to his jacket, its colors catching the light, a quiet declaration of who he was. But the night wasn't without its shadows. As they passed a group of older locals, Elliot caught a whisper, "Unnatural," and his stomach twisted. Miles squeezed his hand, his voice low. "They don't matter." "We do." Elliot nodded, but the word lingered, a reminder of the work still ahead. Willow Creek was changing, but it wasn't there yet. Neither was his dad. That night, Tom called, his voice gruff but softer than before. "I'm trying, Elliot," he said. "I don't understand it, but you're my son." It wasn't everything, but it was enough for now. Elliot hung up, tears in his eyes, and Miles pulled him close, their foreheads touching in the quiet of Sarah's living room. The next week, Miles got a job offer in Seattle, a graphic design gig that would keep him close. He showed Elliot the email, his eyes searching. "I want to stay. For us. But only if you're in." Elliot's heart swelled. He thought of the picnic, of that first touch, of the trees that had hidden them and the world that was slowly opening up. "I'm in," he said, the words steady, sure. They moved to Seattle a month later, renting a small apartment with a view of the city skyline. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but it was theirs. Elliot started therapy, working through years of fear and shame, while Miles filled their home with sketches and laughter. They built a life together, one moment at a time, rooted in the courage they'd found beneath the trees. Years later, at another Willow Creek picnic, Elliot returned, Miles by his side. The town had changed. Pride flags dotted a few lawns, and the whispers were quieter now. Sarah ran up, hugging them both, her smile wide. Elliot's parents were there too, their greetings tentative but warm. Tom clapped Elliot on the shoulder, a small gesture that meant the world. As the sun set, Elliot and Miles slipped away to the oak trees, the place where it all began. They stood close, hands entwined, the memory of that first touch as vivid as ever. "We made it," Miles said, his voice thick with emotion. Elliot nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Yeah, we did." Beneath the trees, they kissed, the world around them fading. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise kept, a life reclaimed, a love that had changed everything. And as the fireflies danced around them, Elliot knew that no matter what came next, they'd face it together, unapologetically themselves.